Astrology was practiced in Rome as far back as the 3rd century BC. This early astrology developed alongside the cultural and military expansion of the Roman Empire. Rome drew on the traditions of countries bordering the Mediterranean, like Egypt and Greece, to establish its own mythological framework. The ancient concept of as above, so below was the subject of our first program. It found practical applications in the Roman Empire, a civilization that took the concept of natural law to a high degree of refinement. Rome developed systems of law and order in diverse fields of human expression that are still used to this day. From the construction of roads to civic planning and sanitation, from state education to the political system itself. And throughout the establishment of these pillars of civilization, astrology could be found advising and directing the movers and makers of the Roman Empire. But it was only when all parties in Rome, including the philosophers and the intellectuals, began to discuss astrology openly that the people of the Roman Republic were slowly converted to it, some centuries before Christianity emerged. The source of astrology is not just in the heavens, but also in the myth and legends of races. And the Roman race was not as rich as many were in myth and legend. But astrology took what Roman myths there were and placed them in the starry patterns of the constellations. The 12 most important were those that the sun passed through in the course of a year. They One was really a god who has come to life in human form. Romulus and Remus fitted this legend exactly and typified the archetype of Gemini. But as Rome developed, 2 other astrological factors became prominent, and we shall look at these later in this program. Rome expanded rapidly, readily admitting foreigners and neighboring tribes. she quickly developed an efficient army and drew her gods from the same pantheon as those of the Greeks. Rome had conquered Greece and her colonies by the 2nd century BC, and the army and its huge retinue brought back to Rome their concepts of Greek deities. The early conquest and annexation of Greece hastened what became the miscegenation of Roman and Greek gods. It brought, for example, Jupiter in place of the Greek Zeus, and Mars in the place of the Greek Ares, and so on. And still very early in Roman history, the city bristled with the statues and temples of these gods. Rationalization of the Roman gods into zodiacal expression means that the divine was brought into the everyday life of the populace, a process of magic if ever there were. And the many temples and statues and their attendant ceremonials made the magic almost a reality. As in Hindu worship today, there were gods in Rome for everything. Astrology helped to give the worn-out pantheon of Roman gods new meaning. Jupiter, for example, reawakened in early Rome in the sign of Taurus, shown here. But in esoteric astrology today, Jupiter's affinity is with the sign of Aquarius. Venus was, as it still is today, linked to the sign of Gemini, and Ceres, the goddess of grain, was associated with the sign of Virgo. John Waterhouse's classic style shows the awakening of the god Adonis, astrologically the sun, awakened by Venus, of course. And it was astrology that kissed new life into the many gods of Rome. In esoteric astrology, old and new, Venus in conjunction with the sun brings light-heartedness, sweet humor, and the meeting of true lovers. But astrology now began to develop so quickly that its sages lost control of its ethical standards. The population of Rome burgeoned to an unbelievable 4 million. The astrology of Rome suggested appropriate times to propitiate the gods, and inevitably the personal horoscope emerged. Initially, these horoscopes were for the emperor and for the most powerful people of the land. Later, for the aristocracy, and finally for the common man. Thus astrology spread far and wide, for Rome was ruler of all states bordering the Mediterranean, a Roman hegemony over virtually the then known and civilized world. Greek slaves began to arrive in Rome in large numbers as Roman militarism pressed eastwards into Greece's orbit of culture. They were brought into work on the palaces of the Caesars and the hundreds of temples and places of worship. Work previously done by the soldiers, but the army was now increasingly required to maintain the growing empire. It was through these slaves that the astrology of Greece infiltrated Rome, and the practice of astrology grew concurrently with the proliferation of the new temples to the gods. When the slaves arrived in their new home, their talents were often regenerated and redirected. They were taken into the services of both the new and the old Roman aristocracy. In the latter, they were used in the same tasks that Greece was famous for, but in the ever-increasing number of estates of the new aristocracy, they had to adapt profoundly. There was intrigue, sexuality, and corruption to contend with. Homosexuality was rife within some aristocratic circles, from the servants right up to the emperors, and including both men and women. The Roman baths were meeting places for the social set. Their masseurs were most often slaves, some with knowledge of astrology, Greek astrology, that is. But most of the Greek astrologers were charlatans without real knowledge, who would predict anything for anyone. At first, the aristocratic Romans would have none of it, and the Greek slaves plied their wares amongst the lower classes, of which they were always a part. Later, many grew rich and were able to buy their freedom and became fully fledged Roman citizens, thus adding some authority to the incipience of astrology. The patrician class, though always a minority, began to gain influence and give their approval to astrology that was at first a fad, then a fashion, and ultimately leaders, and they brought astrology with them to the very heart of the Roman Empire. And then, of course, there were the games. The Roman populaces were benighted and obsessed with circuses, arenas, charioteering, spectacles, and gladiatorial combat. Bets on the outcome of fights were inevitable, and this is where astrology reached its lowest levels of infamy. Its practitioners were called the astrologers of the circuses, for, sadly, most of their earnings came from predicting the winners of chariot racing. But those who were in competition with astrologers, the so-called augurs of Rome, the seers and traditional diviners of the future, felt threatened and had the astrologers expelled in large numbers. And they were easy to expel because they were rarely actual citizens of Rome. Cornelius Hispaclus expelled the astrologers of his time, saying, "These Chaldeans exploit the people under the false pretense of reading the stars." His decree stated that astrology was an unreliable means of prediction, but this only served to strengthen the popularity of astrology. Tertullian, the celebrated defender of the early Christians, saw them as a public nuisance and reported with great glee about the year 150 AD that some had been expelled for being consulted about how long the current ruler, the Emperor Severus, or even worse, the Emperor Caracalla, would live, and whether he would be assassinated, which he soon was. No one popularized astrology more than the Emperor Augustus. He was steeped in astrology. Augustus traced his male lineage back to Julius Caesar. The ill-fated Julius Caesar was himself only mildly interested in astrology, being in search of power through his kingship rather. About to embark on an expedition to attack the Parthians, Caesar, anxious no doubt for a suitable sailing time, is made to consult an old astrologer in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. In the play, Caesar is warned of the danger of doing anything in the Ides of March, but he walks to the Senate during the fateful period, and a group of 60 senators conspiring together assassinated him. The war god Mars had often protected him in bloody battle, but on this day the stars were against him. Augustus, who bore the name of Octavian when he was a child, was the boy heir of Caesar. He had been at school in the Balkans when he was written into Caesar's will as his hereditary successor. The historian Tiberius tells us a revealing story. Augustus mounted with Agrippa to the studio of the astrologer Theogenes. Agrippa was the first to have his horoscope read, and when a great and almost incredible career was predicted for him, Augustus persisted in concealing the time of his own birth. He refused to disclose it through diffidence and fear that he might be found to be less eminent. When at last he gave it, unwillingly and hesitatingly, and only after many urgent requests, Theogenes sprang up and threw himself at Augustus's feet. From that time, Augustus had such faith in his destiny that he made his horoscope public. Among his legacies to Rome was the world's largest sundial, an ingenious device that used the shadow cast by an obelisk to indicate both hour and date. One of the first acts of the emperor was to restore the patriciate of Rome officially. However, there was no love lost between the old peers of the realm and the new aristocracy. The peerage had slaves and parasites, and with them in the boudoirs of Rome, where there were the Messalinas of imperial history, there was murderous intrigue, as Julius Caesar had discovered to his cost, and Greek slaves brought astrology into this kind of intrigue. The process of selecting Caesars, whether from within the army or without, was always, or nearly always, indelibly linked with astrology. Both the emperors Augustus and Tiberius knew Thrasyllus, an astrologer who had edited the writings of Plato. Tiberius had met him in Rhodes and brought him back to Rome. He remained a personal friend for 40 years. Some astrologers became prosperous beyond belief, like Balbulus, a close friend and astrologer of the emperor Claudius. The granddaughter of Thrasyllus Emperors sometimes executed astrologers who made wrong forecasts. Caesar would even ask his astrologer how long he, the astrologer, expected to live. If the answer was, "I expect to live many years, Your Majesty," the emperor might have him executed on the spot to prove him wrong. Sir Walter Scott and Quentin Durward makes King Louis XI ask his astrologer the same question. The wily man saves himself by replying, "I shall die 24 hours before you do, sire." The king is forced to leave it at that. Marulius, the Augustan poet, wrote an extensive didactic poem, really a work of science, called Astronomica. In Astronomica he placed Rome and therefore Italy in the sign of Libra, as we still do to this day. But in those early days there was a very powerful additional astrological influence. Behind the success and failure of astrology in public life, there was a matter of deeper significance. It was the extraordinary achievements of the Roman armies in what is now merely a matter for history. The frontiers of Rome had been rolled back in every direction, from the huge basin of the Mediterranean Sea outwards. As we have already seen, the army itself had provided many of the Caesars of Rome, but energizing all these with rampant and incomparable combativeness was the astrological god of war, Mars. Mars, which was the ruler of the Scorpio sign, the sign of blood and unbridled fury. Romulus, the founder of Rome, was the son of Mars, and this powerful and early feature of astrology assured Rome victory on almost every battlefield from the start, not only on land, but at sea as well. Scorpio, as all astrologers well know, is a water sign. War, the use of concentrated power. Mars is also the lord of the metal iron. Iron swords, iron helmets, breastplates of iron. Triumphs, bloody wounds, and desecrations. We still recognize these qualities in the rulership of Mars to this day. This was especially so in Rome 2,500 years ago. Mars was red then with clouds of war and conflict, and today, lo and behold, what is roving the red surface of iron-strewn Mars at this moment? An engine, the Mars rover, a metallic probe. Astrology, by some extraordinary epiphany, has today once again described the very nature of a planet it named all those years ago. For the surface of Mars, we find in 1997 is red, red strewn with the rust of iron, a testimony to a blind fury that tore across the surface and gouged canyons and waterways and strewed boulders and mudbanks across the surface of the red planet. Today, the blood and gore of Mars and Scorpio have given way in Italy to a nation in love with peace, firmly now under the sign of Libra, the sign of equity and balance. The triumphal arch of war now surrenders to the supporting arches of the freeway, and the ruthlessness of soldiered man to the common welfare of Italian businessmen and thronging tourists. Libra is now the dominating sign of Rome and of Italy itself, the sign of conciliation and partnership. It has been a long time coming. Rome gave us many things, but of all these, to me, the most precious has been astrology.